So now we have a panel about security, right? So I'm handing over to those gentlemen. If you would be so kind to introduce yourself.
I'm Richard Schneeman. I work for Heroku, and I just gave a talk on security.
Nice to meet you.
I'm Arne Brasseur, and you might know me from the lightning talk about security from yesterday.
Hi, I'm Piotr. Niełacny. I will be there in a minute about things we can do in Ruby. Last year I participated to build some code that created a scanning automatic tool for security tools for Rails.
I'm Bryan Helmkamp. I'm the founder of Code Climate, and I also gave a lightning talk about security.
All right. So I would like you to start with the topic of security principles, how they relate to Ruby and Rails, and maybe what Rails gives us a default, what we take for granted.
For default, for sure, SQL injections when we use in proper way, and HTML safe method for helpers and cross-site requests.
Yeah, so Rails being a web framework, it's like the two sort of structural problems with web applications are the cross-site request forgery and the cross-site scripting. So Rails tries hard to make sure that you do the right thing with security tokens for the cross-site request forgery. Also, escaping in views is now on by default, so that should go a long way in preventing cross-site scripting. Yeah, but you still need to know what you're doing.
So I like that it's just mostly secure by default, unless you do something really stupid. And in general, I've been using Rails for 5-6 years. If they can generalize a fix for something, then they will, and that's pretty good. Like I think Steve is famous for the like every time I use Sinatra, like I end up building an impromptu copy of Rails, and like it doesn't have the CSRF protection in there by default, I don't think, or like encrypted cookie. It does.
The point is you don't know.
Oh yeah, I didn't even know. Come on. Or yeah, and there's like encrypted cookies and all this other stuff, and yeah, there's like just a lot that it does for you.
I mean, you guys did a great job of covering the stuff that Rails does, so I'll talk about the one thing that I've been harping on recently as the insecure default in Rails, which is the generation of the secret token RB file when you create your application. Most developers, if you don't think about it, it might not realize that that's basically a root key for your entire application. So Rails does all this stuff. They've got 17 security measures which protect against this, that, and the other thing. And they generate a root key, and then they put it in a file, and you check it in, and you push it to GitHub. Don't do that. I've talked to those guys. I've been trying to see if there's a way we can change the default where it's still easy for developers to use, but it's not so easy to just commit that and start using the same secret token in production that you're using in development. Those should be different, and in production it should be configured with an environment variable.
Yes, please. maybe even rotatable secure keys in environment variables. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to add then that one thing that Rails at the moment also doesn't do, something that's going to change also with Rails 4, and this is you need to realize when your request token for CSRF protection is not checked, which is basically on GET requests, and we all know that GET requests should be safe, but a common sort of mistake that gets made if you have some controller action that's not resourceful, that's just doing something something odd, something on the side, and typically you would expect a put or a post there, but you just put a match route in your routes. That match route is also going to match gets, and then your CSRF is not checked. So Rails 4 is not going to allow that anymore. You'll have to be explicit. You'll have to either use a verb to specify your route or say match via these verbs. But yeah, that's one thing in Rails 3 that a mistake that you can still make.
Okay, so Rails does a great job by defining the defaults for security. However, when you go off Rails, you can we're so used to Rails defaults that you can easily forget what we have. And what are the other security principles that you have to still care for? What about some input validations?
Yeah, so I think when I talk to developers about security, I think the principles are sort of the most interesting part because the technologies are always changing. Rails will always be adding new security measures, and attacks for web applications are continuing to evolve. But if you look at all those things, they all come back to the same sorts of principles when you're looking to secure applications. So you've got things like, I'll just pick one, defense in depth, right? The idea that you shouldn't predicate the entire security of your system on the concept that one of your security measures is broken, because when it gets broken, and it almost certainly will at some point, then you are completely vulnerable. So a lot of the things that you need to do to secure your application are about thinking about concepts like defense in depth and least privilege, and those things are kind of universal through web security and other forms of security, and kind of will, if you can sort of get your head around those and start thinking through the different problems and attack vectors, you'll put yourself in a much better position.
We should look out on the string interpolation always, so, and don't use method call.
Yeah, so that's actually a very good point, and it's still kind of like an unsolved problem that a lot of the time we're passing around strings and interpolating strings, but like inside these strings are semantics. Could be, you know, HTML or SQL or CSS or JavaScript. And so that's why you have all these different ways of escaping strings. And a lot of security problems basically boil down to this. Like, you know, if you're doing like a lot of JavaScript in your views, if you're doing a one-page app and you're sort of pre-populating it with data, make sure that that JSON is properly escaped, these kind of things.
Yeah, like Rails is a giant framework for generating really long strings. It's kind of crazy when you think about it like that. I think mass assignment, actually, that was kind of a big thing for a while, where yes, we have these tools and these manners where we can whitelist and blacklist attributes, but people just weren't using them correctly. And that's almost kind of a scenario where people know the right thing to do, they just don't do the right thing because the programming tools are there and kind of are harder. And in Rails 4, now there's the controller level assignments, and I don't know if that's going to 100% solve the problem, because the programmer can still do the wrong thing, but it's just maybe a little bit more in your face if you choose to do the wrong thing.
Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting about that is when you're looking at the security of a system, I think you said yesterday that security is kind of an emergent property. And one of the reasons for that is security issues generally show up at the seams between different layers. So if you listen to the examples, some of the examples were about interpolating strings, let's say transmitting information from the application to the database, or the application to the browser for cross-site scripting, or the parameters from the request to the model, which then makes their way to the database. Boundaries create security issues. Shell injection, if you do anything in backticks, you want to be very careful, or eval. That's usually if I'm trying to figure out where an application has weakness, it's always going to be the boundaries between the different layers that you're going to start at, where one layer is fine with having information in a certain way, but when it passes it off to the other layer, it doesn't know exactly how to interpret that.
Okay, so the related question is, are there any tools that can help you find the places that may need manual code audits, or tools that can narrow down the possible problems so you can inspect them manually?
Yeah, for sure you can use Bryan or scanning. In code climate you can use Bryan, yes?
Yes, code climate is based on Bryan.
And Bryan now based on AST?
Yes.
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 And this is when I started working on scanning. Brakeman based on regex. And how long use a split now?
I'm not sure. It's used. I think it's used an AST-based scanning approach for as long as I've worked with it, which maybe is about 6 months or something like that. Brakeman, for people who might not know, is it's a scanning, security scanning solution that reads in basically all of the code of your application and tries to track the flow of data around to find vulnerabilities. So if you do things like assign a variable to a parameter, and then you later take that variable and you interpolate it into a SQL string, or you put it into your view unescaped, it will try to track that through and show it to you.
Yeah, so Brakeman is a really awesome tool for this. One weakness about it is that it does static analysis on your code. So it works a lot by assuming that your code is Rails code, and because Rails is pretty strong on conventions, it can do pretty smart analysis, but it only goes so far. And yeah, I'd like to pick up on what you were saying earlier about like layers and scenes. So the really big thing is always to sanitize your input, but not only on the outer shell of your application. Like if you have a well-designed system that's kind of layered anyway, then at any layer you can basically force your input to be of a certain type, or sanitize your input, or check a whitelist, or basically like this is how overall your system just becomes more secure. Like even if a path is found in, it's going to stop at the next layer.
So I haven't used Brakeman. It sounds pretty awesome. I think I'll definitely check it out. I think another tool, it's not a technical tool, it's more a cultural tool, is just education and code reviews. Like if you're working on a team of larger than one, if you're not like doing like GitHub flow and like having pull requests and actually having other people look at your code and either say, yes, this is good, or like, no, this is bad. Sure, you can still have security vulnerabilities in your code, but then at least it has to go by 2 people, and that's maybe slightly more secure.
Yeah, you're always going to have vulnerabilities. You're really just trying to continue to upgrade the type of vulnerabilities that you've got.
So yeah, the cool thing though with all the recent vulnerabilities is that it's now at least a hot topic in Ruby land that's being talked about a lot, and so it's getting more mind share. And so it's good to have a few like mental models to help you reason about this thing. And one thing that I found really helpful is thinking about attack surface. So basically, like you can't predict what the next 0-day vulnerability is going to be, but you can make it less likely that you're going to be vulnerable for it. So we've seen that a lot of the recent stuff had to do with Rails input handling, parameter handling. So what Florian also mentioned in his talk yesterday, like if you're not building a service that needs XML input, you can disable Rails parsing XML. That's the whole XML parsing library that's now no longer part of your attack surface. Basically also like think about anything that's in your rec middleware, like anything that touches data that's coming in from the outside, any code that touches data from the outside is part of your attack surface. And so by keeping that small, you're just like lowering the chances of being vulnerable.
Can we learn from the from our previous security mistakes? Can we learn from the other communities that had problems? And what essentially can we do so that the future developers will stand on our shoulders?
We have CVE identifiers, so we can search for issues from other ecosystems, and maybe we can find and mark our mistakes there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult, right? Because the YAML vulnerability, for example, in hindsight is quite obvious, but before you couldn't really, lots of people looked at that code and all nodded and said, yeah, this seems pretty much fine. So the specific issues will be different, but I think the point about surface area is probably the most relevant one for that question, which is just, how much can you minimize the amount of code that you have that's sort of at risk, right? So just simply, the more, we're getting back to the same thing again, the more complexity you have in your application, the more likelihood that there is to have a vulnerability. If you just have 10 lines of code, it does one thing and it accepts exactly one parameter and it doesn't do anything dangerous, it's probably fine. But as you add more and more code, it's probably it's combinatorial, the types of issues that can crop up.
Yeah, so I think that the lesson that Ruby and the Rails community is learning now is that it's always done so much out of the box and made our life so easy, but that comes with a trade-off. And maybe in some of these aspects, it's okay to be just a little bit more on the conservative side, or at least realize that that's a trade-off and that might impact future vulnerabilities.
We definitely have gotten some of the procedures and practices from previous languages, like the way that we notify through mailing lists and disclose vulnerabilities, and even have those security pages. I guess also one other thing that we can take from other languages is the confidence that this will probably happen again. Like this isn't the first time. Like, oh my gosh, we found a vulnerability. And being capable of coping and dealing with that. But we should also, I guess, take care with how we deal with upgrade strategies and making sure, when we jump from the Rails 2 to Rails 3, and there's a ton of very large corporations that we kind of, 100,000 line Rails apps that we kind of lost in the way. And whenever we just tell people it's okay, you can use the older technology, but then they are locked into those code paths. That is, I guess, kind of an area of concern of mine that I don't think we have answers for yet, and maybe we can look to other communities to help answer those.
Yeah, since the original question was sort of what can we learn from this stuff and going forward, the one thing, additional thing that I'll throw out there is cryptography matters, and things like signatures matter. So I'm referring specifically to the RubyGems issue when RubyGems.org was considered to potentially be compromised, and all of the gems had to be verified in a very impractical way. But with cryptography, it only matters so much as you can trust the actual, while you're doing key management and what infrastructure you have in place to establish trust. So that doesn't exist in the Ruby infrastructure, I'm told. Maybe you guys would know, but if you use Maven or maybe in the Java world, they actually do a lot of real signed packages with enough infrastructure to be able to sort of verify those signatures relatively confidently. That doesn't exist in Ruby, so that would be probably the one thing over the past few months that I would say, if there's a hard problem, because signing things is easy, and there's been a lot of pull requests going around on GitHub saying, let's sign this gem, let's sign that gem, but if you can't verify the signature, it's basically no better than a checksum, which can be overwritten. So that's something that I think is going to be difficult for us to resolve, but is probably the biggest area I'd say we can learn from.
Okay, so I have another question. What are the recent advancements in security field, or maybe a technology improvements in browsers that are most significant to you from the perspective what they give to developers, to the users?
We have new secure hash library, version 3 based on AES, and we can easily port it to hardware acceleration. So I think we will use it in our web applications soon.
For me, the biggest thing lately has been content security policies. So this stuff is pretty new, and it's not trivial to apply to your application. It's not like a lot of security measures where you're just updating 1 or 2 lines of code and you're good to go and you don't have to worry about it anymore. But content security policies, in short, basically, it's a header that you add to your page that says this is where the scripts are allowed to come from. Also other things, but I'm simplifying. You say, okay, my scripts on this page must all come from my CDN. And there's no inline script at all that should be permitted on this page, and no scripts that come from any other website should be allowed on this page. And then the browser, if there's an inline script, won't run it. If there's a script from a server that's not your CDN, it won't run it. So this is a great advancement in terms of protecting against cross-site scripting, which is probably the biggest sort of boogeyman out there that's facing people's web applications today. And it's just a totally different layer, disconnected from everything else that you're still going to want to do anyway. But you've got this fallback, and you can say to the browser, there should never be any inline scripts on this page at all. So if there is one, just don't run it. And it actually has a mechanism to give you feedback that it saw one, or it saw something that violated the policy, so you can actually log that information and then analyze it later.
Cool.
Okay. How should we respond to security problems? How can we stay up to date?
So subscribing to mailing lists is definitely one of them. Actually, when the YAML vulnerability came out, Heroku, like this is the first time that I'm aware of this, actually sent out like emails to pretty much everyone who's running on Heroku, being like, hey, yo, this is actually a really serious thing, and like you need to pay attention. And I guess that even that won't catch 100% of the cases, but like there's a large number of times where somebody might have changed their email address or something. So, but yeah, like putting an effort into it, and even having like some sort of a support network if you're gone, if you're on vacation, having other people that you can know and can trust can be like, hey, by the way, here's something that you should maybe update.
Yeah, I think also more and more people in companies will now start thinking about having an actual contingency plan. Like if you think you've been compromised or if something happens, that it's not all just screaming around with your hands waving, but that you actually kind of have a step-by-step procedure. Okay, let's take this system offline, rebuild from scratch if necessary, try to find out what happened. So yeah, just building that kind of plan and being more conscious about it, and having people on site or on call for that kind of thing. It's definitely something we're learning.
Yeah, I think the most challenging part is Rails actually does a fantastic job of disclosing its vulnerabilities in a very structured way. They have a team, they have a system for every vulnerability that they go through step by step. The issue is the other 98 gems that you have in your gem file, that only 10 of which you actually declared, and most of them don't have any formal process for doing security disclosures. So you're kind of just left wandering around in the dark. Trying to follow gem maintainers on Twitter, maybe they'll mention that their gem was unsafe. I mean, if you ask most gem maintainers and you say, okay, real quick, what do you do when somebody realizes that there's a vulnerability in your gem? What do you do? And they'll say, I fix it. And then I push it to GitHub. And then maybe I release a point release version. And that's about it. So it's very challenging. There's an effort underway to index in a database all of the vulnerabilities that have been recorded against gems even beyond Rails. That's a project on GitHub called RubySec that has a Ruby Advisory DB project, which is just ironically a bunch of YAML files. I tried to tell them that maybe we shouldn't use YAML for it, but they wanted to use YAML.
Just lost my question.
Okay.
Okay, I got it. What do you think about in that scenario, like if you're a gem author, yanking versus not? I've run into a number of scenarios where somebody's hard-coded, reliant on a very specific version, but then somebody might yank it for whatever reason.
Yeah. That's
That's really interesting. I mean, a lot of the vulnerabilities are contextual, right? It's like maybe it's one affected method and you might use it or you might not. So it gets into this gray area, like should you pull it, but some users might not be using the method, so they might be okay. Definitely, I think one thing is the more you can streamline your ability to deploy your application, that's a huge win, right? So the people who you need to react to these issues very quickly. The YAML issue in particular, I don't know if everyone knows this, but there were automated point-and-click root your server exploits in the wild within about 12 hours of when that dropped. So if you took more than 12 hours to patch your server, and I'm sure some of you did, you were slower than it took to create an automated system to point at your server and say, I would like to take everything that's there. So if your deploy process takes 24 hours, you're basically screwed. So the faster you can deploy, the faster you can do things like rebuild a new infrastructure if you get compromised. Ruby Gems was another example of this, right? They got hacked and they had apparently no automation. I don't know quite what happened there. I know those guys are doing a lot of really important hard work, but somehow it turned into a chef automation project. And it became... What's that?
I can talk to you about that later.
Okay, I'd love to hear.
It was that they were already planning on moving to Chef, and this
Yes.
was the impetus of like, we might as well finish it.
Yes, right, okay, so I sensed there was some of that, like, oh, this was the plan, but now we really need to do it. But on Twitter, it's kind of just like, well, nobody can deploy, and we're waiting for some cookbooks to be written. Which is not quite
The
ideal.
server was compromised. The other
Yes.
problem was that a lot of people were saying like, you can't redeploy to that server
Right.
because that server was compromised. You're a bad person if you
Right,
do.
which is basically true.
But it's because of that pushback, and so that
Right.
rather than invest in the Chef stuff. So like, it's
Yeah, but they also changed data centers.
totally.
Yeah, so that might have been a bit much.
Okay, I think
Sorry, one more thing about the gems. So I think it's also important discipline for library authors and gem authors, how to deal with their version numbering. So tiny numbers should only be for bug fixes and security fixes. Your minor, like the middle number, for non-breaking, like changes that are compatible with the previous version, and only introduce non-compatible changes in a new major version. That way you can like specify with tilde greater than in your gem file, and just get these like bug fixes, security related fixes with minimal chance of breaking your system. So you really should do that, and if you like log into a very fixed version, like to the last number fixed version in your gem file, I don't think it's a good idea. But yeah, that's something that not everybody has follows that discipline.
So we always should we start with 1.0 version? What about 0.8?
Okay, I think that we can discuss the semantic versioning later. We have some time left for the questions from the audience. Okay.
Yeah, so you were asked earlier that what can the Rails community do, and one of the facets of the question was what can the community do to enable future developers to develop more secure software, and you kind of skipped that. So I was wondering if you could iterate over that again. So I mean, what can we do to enable future developers to quickly be safer?
I would say it's education. The stuff that you can do to help developers quickly be safer is creating secure defaults and secure tools, and Rails does a very good job of that. Everything else, now you've sort of upgraded and bought yourself more difficult vulnerabilities to deal with, and now you're in the realm of needing to educate developers about how these things work, the principles that are in play, and the actual current information about how applications are being protected. There was a mention earlier, I think maybe it was you, that Rails has a security guide. That is a good resource. It's a good start, but it's not totally comprehensive. So I think there's opportunity for improvements in some of the content as well.
Yeah, I think education and like showing people good practices. I think there are also too many tutorials out there that sort of, for the sake of simplicity, gloss over security stuff and actually show you stuff that aren't best practices. So something that we need to be more aware of.
I just wanted to point out, earlier you spoke about how putting multiple components together a larger code creates a combinatorial explosion of possibilities for vulnerabilities. I just wanted to point out there's another factor, I agree with that, and then there's another factor that accelerates that, which is the more complicated the code or the more pieces there are, the harder it is to understand at a glance, or the easier it is to miss something in a code review. So it's actually a double whammy. The more complicated your code path, say, is from user input to database and back, you're getting both the possibility of a vulnerability in the code itself and the possibility, almost certainty, that someone will not understand what the code is doing. So it's a bit of a double whammy. Yeah. And for that reason, simplicity, I think, is security.
Okay, and one last question.
Yes. Sorry.
We agree.
I don't see anyone. Okay, so I think that we can finish this security panel. Thank you all.